when we first met, and I'm sure you would agree with this, you were not the picture of health.
Metabolic syndrome, very likely, well on my way to pre-diabetes.
You've had a pretty substantial change. What was it, do you think, really made the difference?
Suddenly it was like this moment of like, hey, wait a minute. If I don't drive this bus, nobody is going to. My inflammation numbers went literally from off the chart on the high side to off the chart on the low side. A friend of mine kind of, it's like, wow, what's been going on? What's happening? And he was interested. So I said, I'll share with you everything that's happened. Anyway, in his case, he went and had a calcium score, was off the chart. And his doc freaked out a little bit, like, well, we're going to put you on a statin. And he's like, I think I can get some more information. I'd like to go do a CIMT. I'd like to do a stress test. No, we don't need it. Went to a cardiologist, finally. Cardiologist said, no, we'll put you on a statin. I just want more data. So they started a stress test and they were 2 minutes into it. The cardiologist said, whoa. And they go in and take a look and they found an 80% blockage. Probably saved his life. The moral of the story is that I've bought onto is like, look, you want to catch stuff as early as you can.
You're the first person who I ever heard say this. You interviewed
Yes.
them, right?
Yes, I
to
did.
find the right primary care doc. Let's talk about testosterone.
I chose a clomid cycle. One of the guys said to me, he said, how old are you? And I said, 57. He's like, oh my God, we're having a hard time keeping up with you. And
My name is Matt Kaeberlein, and welcome to the Optispan YouTube channel. Hey everyone, welcome to the Optispan podcast. And today we're going to speak to, I don't know if I'd call you Trailblazer number one, but pretty close. Maybe Dave is Trailblazer number one, but
Sure.
Stuart is right up there, one of the early adopters in Optispan. And actually, Stuart was involved really before Optispan even existed in helping us figure out what we were going to be, what we were going to do, what this thing was going to look like. So it is a thrill to have you back in the podcast studio to have a conversation today about your personal health experience. Certainly we'll talk about your experiences in the Trailblazer program, but sort of what led up to that and what you've learned as you have sort of, I think, experienced something similar to myself where you have taken control of your own health and really, had a sort of a profound impact on your own well-being and also the people around you. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and we'll see where it goes.
Great. Well, it's great to be at Optispan World Headquarters. And, full disclosure, it's really been a privilege and a blessing that I crossed paths with you. One thing talking about when the early start, I love to ask people, like, look, did I tell you the truth? Because, we're a couple years later, and I hope you would say, yep, you painted the picture for me.
Yeah.
But, following you around to Copenhagen and to the Buck Institute and to Austin and to other places and having you make an imprint on me has been really helpful. So I'm incredibly grateful for that.
Awesome.
So, this whole experience has been very, very positive for me. It hasn't been easy. I mean, as you know, trying to run the organization and build stuff up. I mean, that alone is tough, but it's tough.
Yeah.
And I would say I have less control over my healthcare, but I've taken responsibility for it.
Yeah.
It really comes down to kind of a responsibility of like, look, I have to do some actions, and I might have to do some things that are uncomfortable. But if I have a purpose, which we'll talk about, that really helps.
Yeah. So we'll, maybe before we dive into like the Trailblazer experience and your own health experience, we can set the stage for people, give a little bit of background. So maybe let's go all the way back to the beginning. So you've had sort of I don't know if it's the beginning, but you've had a pretty interesting, I would say, career trajectory, right? So you worked at Sabi Corporation way back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
And then you actually ran a mall in Spokane, Washington, and worked in the office of the governor for the state of Washington, and worked at Microsoft and at Disney somewhere in there, and at an AI startup company. And then I first got to know you probably 2 years ago now through Dave Sabi, and it was really, you and me and George Haddad who, really worked on the genesis of what Optispan has become. So I don't know if you want to say anything about sort of like how your career experiences sort of, prepared you for this journey, and I know that at least when we first met, and I'm sure you would agree with this, don't take this the wrong way, but you were not the picture of health, right? I mean,
Absolutely not.
You've had a pretty substantial change in your health trajectory just in the time that we've known each other. So
That's right.
maybe it'd be useful just kind of, if you're comfortable, talk about both how you got to that point when we first met, and then what was it that sort of changed the course for you in terms of your health.
Well, I'm happy to talk about just about anything, because one of the big reasons I'm here is I want to help people.
Yeah.
Not only help myself, but help people. I mean, it's my own mental health. It's self-seeking to really help others. But, from a career perspective, Mickey Mouse, Microsoft, and government, I mean, what's the correlation? I'm not sure. But, even I might even go back a little bit farther. My mom was director of surgery. She was a nurse. My dad died when I was 3. She went back to school, not when it was so popular, I think, for women to be in school, and, but she became director of surgery after being an RN, and I knew I didn't want to get into medicine, but I was very, very fortunate to have a mom who, worked her tail off, but, put a roof over my head.
Yeah.
But I got involved in drugs and alcohol really early. This is an important part of my story. And so I got in, probably less trouble than I should have when I was younger, but I was incredibly fortunate to step off that train at a pretty young age.
When do you feel like you stepped off that train? I asked because you and I have very sort of similar, at least from a macro perspective, childhood experiences.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was common. I mean, when we grew up, partying and drinking and drugging and, all that kind of stuff, at least the environment I was. I mean, candidly, in my family, alcoholism and addiction and the pathology we talk about that goes through generation to generation, like a forest fire. It's true in my family, like most other families. But I was 23. It was 35 years ago. So I can tell you, that that's a different topic. We can go into that detail. But I was fortunate to, it stuck for me. And I went back to school. I was kind of a non-traditional back at school, leaned in. It was very different. When you show up and you sit in the front of the class, you have a very, very different experience than if you're kind of just showing up getting by.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's kind of been my experience, is I'll kind of, dabble around something, but when I lean into something, it's a full send. And I think that's been, helped me in some places when I pick the right thing to send towards.
Yeah. It's interesting because I don't know if I've ever really told you about my sort of formative years and that.
You sure you want to talk about it?
Yeah, I mean,
Sure.
yeah, absolutely. So, but it's very similar. I mean, it's kind of striking to me how similar it is. So my father and mother were divorced when I was like in 3rd grade, and suddenly I was the man of the house in many ways. At least I thought I was.
You were.
But I also, probably 7th grade got into drinking, smoking. Did a lot of drugs.
We did grow up in the Seattle area.
I did, a lot of drugs through high school. But I think by the time I graduated from high school, I was pretty much done with the drugs. The alcohol went on for a while after that. But also, didn't go right to undergraduate right out of high school. Worked early morning at United Parcel Service, in the evening delivering auto glass. Learned how to work, learned a lot of lessons that way. But when I did go back to school, I had grown up and I actually wanted to learn. And it, like you were saying, it's a completely different experience at that point, right? And what you get out of it is what you bring into it. And I actually leaned in, much as not like you did, and had a great experience in education and got a great education, even though I went to a university. I mean, I went to community college, got my AA degree, and then went to Western Washington University, which is not considered one of the premier universities, even in the state of Washington. But I had a fantastic education because I wanted it, right? I actually did the work, and it just makes complete difference.
Well, to go from Bellingham to MIT is pretty impressive.
Culture shock. Yeah.
So if you get yourself in the right flow, I mean, cream does rise to the top. And when you're showing up every day and leaning in, I mean, when I went back to school, I was at Lewis Clark State College, which is, certainly not a premier institution at all, but, the textbooks are the same. I had some other experiences later in my career when I was working at, an internet startup, Starway, before I got to Disney, and got to go to an event at Stanford Business School.
Yeah.
And I remember sitting there thinking, this is an event they do on Tuesday afternoon with the Business Students Club. And the people that were in the room were unbelievable. It was all the leaders of the internet companies at the time. And I could date myself. This was back before the internet was really cool. But I remember sitting in the audience thinking, this event would have been the event of the decade at Gonzaga, where I got my graduate degree. But Lewis Clark State couldn't even have considered, like, it would be inconceivable in that environment, even though the content was the same. But, when I got done graduated, I was fortunate. I was getting close to an accounting degree. And I just realized I didn't want to run a 10 key during tax season, right? This is, computers were pretty new. PCs were around. I was working in the computer lab to get through school, which is another stupid, dumb luck kind of thing for me. Like, oh, I get to be working on computers every day.
Yeah.
Or at least helping other students. And one of the profs said to me, have I thought about grad school? And I'm like, what's grad school? So, took the GMAT, did really well. So I've had some really good direction from people that I've heard at the right time. So anyway,
some
so
of
the
it's
rest
just
of
being in the right place at the right time, right? I look
100%.
back at my own life and I'm amazed at how much of it just seems like dumb luck.
Yep.
But, so, I mean, let's talk a little bit about your own health journey over the last couple of years. So maybe set the stage and tell us kind of where you were at, or where you feel like you were at, when you first came into the Optispan sphere, so to speak.
We should show an image now of the "Don't Judge a Book by the Cover" from the Optispan pitch deck, one of the first pitch decks, and that really became, because I'm competitive. Dave showed me his picture, and I'm like, oh, okay, well, let me see what I can do. But I was very typical, right? Metabolic syndrome, very likely, well on my way to pre-diabetes.
And did you have a primary care doc at that point?
I did. And I had been pretty good. I mean, the 20 years at Microsoft, I had good health care. And it wasn't just that I had good health care, but I knew I'm going to go to see the dentist. I'm going to go to the eye doc.
So you actually went, which is different from a lot of people who don't even regularly go see their primary care
I was in
docs.
once a year, right? And, doing, some very basic blood work. But it was, unfortunately, this is something I would certainly change, because now, having met you, I would love more of the historical data.
Yeah, me too.
Right.
Yeah.
And we'll share some of the data that I have, but I have great data over the last couple of years.
Right.
I can show you some very specific things.
Right.
But, my kids had grown, raised 4 kids, and, I was kind of strung out. And, it was 60 pounds heavier than I am now. Some of the other biomarkers we'll talk about.
So what does that put you at? 60 pounds heavier?
260.
260.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you're how tall?
6 feet.
Okay. So
right on the button.
Yeah. So does that put you in the obese range?
Oh yeah,
BMI?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. In fact, interestingly now, I still feel, that's one of my goals now, is I'm very focused on lean tissue and muscle mass, because I know as I continue to age that, that's probably one of, if not the most important thing for me at this point.
Right. And was your first DEXA the same time I got my first DEXA, when the body spec van came
I think
out?
so.
Okay.
I think so. As I recall, didn't we call them? Or I had done one before, and then I had done one before.
Oh, right, with body spec.
Yeah, because probably Peter Attia.
But it was just a couple months before.
Yeah.
Yeah, I asked because talking about historical data, right? You don't really know what your body composition was when you were at your heaviest.
No.
I'm just wondering, when a lot of people lose that much weight. Well, but when a lot of people lose that much weight, how much of it was lean mass versus fat mass? And so again, this is where it would be nice to know what that historical data is. But
I absolutely agree. And, I think that's the vicious cycle that I'd been on in the past too, right? Because I'd lose weight.
Yeah.
But, you lose muscle. Yeah. And then you gain fat, and you lose muscle, and you gain fat. And the roller coaster isn't a roller coaster. It's a spiral.
Yeah.
And I was very typical in that regard, and not a lot of knowledge. I mean, the way you say it, nobody told us we could, nobody told us how, and nobody told us we should. Nobody made it easy.
Yeah.
And it's not easy, but with a little bit of information and prioritization, I think that's the other thing. You can't do it all.
Right.
Right.
So, what were the strategies? I guess a couple of questions. Like, what was it? Do you think that, first of all, really made the difference? Like, do you remember? Did you make a decision one day, like, okay, I'm gonna get on a different path and and change this, or was it a gradual thing? And then what are some of the strategies that have been most effective for you as you went through that process of losing that much weight and getting to a better place?
Yeah, and it's not just the weight too. I think it's important.
Sure.
Some of the numbers we'll talk about, you
Yeah.
know, ApoB and
Yeah.
cholesterol or whatever. But I think part of it was the conversation from Dave, my mentor. Then I came in and saw him, and I hadn't seen him in a while.
Right.
And it was shocking. I'm
He'd
like,
had
I'm like, where's Dave?
striking transformation.
Yeah,
as
where's
well,
Dave?
yeah.
And what happened? And you know, just hearing kind of his attitude and you know, he's very savanty. Like when Dave, you know, he plays like he's really simple, but you listen to him and he's connects some dots and so that was very motivating. And then when I made the commitment to, you know, the early Optispan before it was Optispan, and you know, Dave asked me to come on board and kind of put a framework, put something together. It was full send. I'm like, okay, I'm going to lean in, and I saw his picture, and that I can do that too. So I am going to spend my time, my job, if I'm going to, you know, be part of a healthspan organization, then I need to practice what I preach, right? You know, I don't go to a dentist that has no teeth. Right. I don't go to, you know, it's not that an eye doctor would necessarily, but the eye doctor I go to needs to be talk about eyes, which we'll talk about shopping for primary care physicians, which I've just met a new primary care who I'm really excited about yesterday. You know, the previous primary care doctor I went to, when I asked him, I said, how do you stay on top of things? He goes, well, I'm a little bit older and I'm going to retire soon. And I've been doing this for a long time.
So I don't.
And I'm like, okay, great. You know, you can order blood work for me and we can have some simple conversations, but you know, I'm not interested in, I think maybe Peter said this recently, but you know, in the biohacking community, there's a lot more hacking than there is bio. And I'm not interested in biohacking and wild, crazy stuff and looking for immediate solutions. I'm interested in the bio side of it.
Right.
I bought the premise that aging is a biological function. And if we can understand that, then we can maybe change the shape of the trajectory. I'm not going to stop it. I'm not going to live forever, but I am going to ski with my grandkids. And if I can send a trajectory that way.
Yeah.
So your question, so Dave motivated me.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you had a couple
in.
things, right? You had the motivation from seeing it in somebody who was important in your life.
Very much.
Right. And I think, you know, we have talked about this before and both recognize this sort of network effect when you take control of your own health, impact that it can have on people around you.
I felt responsible. Suddenly it was like this moment of like, hey, wait a minute. If I don't drive this bus, nobody is going to. Like who, you know, and it's kind of back to the recovery stuff for me. You know, I'm really active in recovery and it's important for me to stay sober and all that kind of stuff. But it's about personal accountability and personal inventory.
I think that piece as well is really important. And, you know, it's something where I think you have to strike the right balance, but how do you help people understand that there is this personal accountability piece, right? Like if you don't take control of your own health, nobody else is going to do it for you, right? Yeah. There are people who will give you information, but it's really up to you as the individual to make that choice. And so I think what I was trying to get at is like, what are the factors that influence and help people get to that point, right? And I think one is certainly having important people in your life who have done it, who you can look to and you can see
examples,
success stories. You know, and then I think what else? What are the other things that play an important role there, or at least did for you?
Yeah, you know, one other thing I would just share here, what's really hard now is we're inundated with information.
Yeah.
I mean, some of the stuff we did at Starwave with, you know, ESPN when we launched it and the Go Network, and, you know, we knew the internet was going to be an important and a big deal. But nobody envisioned what it was going to be now, the free flow of information. Unfortunately, good and bad.
Yeah.
So like, you know, literally people watching this, you got to filter the fiction from the noise, and it's really, really hard.
Yeah, it is.
And I think I had a huzzah moment that, you know, my health and wellness isn't going to be captured in a TikTok video. Sorry, and not to pick on TikTok. I mean, I could pick on, it's not going to be a tweet.
Apparently, they're going to be gone in 9 months.
144 characters on Twitter is not going
I know
to,
what you mean.
Right? But as a human being, you know, we're just kind of looking for that easy, and I love talking to my friends. They're like, well, I want to lose weight. What should I eat? What happened? What did you do? And I'm like, eat less.
Yeah. Well, and actually, I mean, this is probably worth saying. You did not take any of the GLP-1 agonists or other medications for weight loss, right? So I think that's the first thing people assume these days. If somebody lost a lot of weight, they took the GLP. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but I mean, it's I think there are some concerns around those medications and their sort of long-term impact. You're talking about the up,
the
down,
Matt
up,
Kaeberlein.
down.
It's maybe.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, we don't know that we don't have the longitudinal, but I'm a huge fan of modern medicine. I mean, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, pharmaceuticals, I am not against them. I'm not against supplements. I'm a maybe guy. I'm like, I don't know. But what the responsibility is, I have to find out for me.
Yeah.
And I think if somebody's listening to this, it's like, I'll give you some answers and tell you what I did. And maybe some of the things that I was involved in would be helpful for you, but you have to figure it out.
Yeah.
I think that's why to get into the, there's whole tactics. We tend to default right to tactics. And the why is also really important, right? The why and the strategies and the tactics. But CGMs, that was a game changer, and they're hard to get. It's amazing trying to negotiate with. So I have multiple friends of mine who I've interacted with and my wife and my family and friends. I'm going to tell a quick story if I can. So a friend of mine kind of is like, wow, what's been going on? What's happening? And he was interested. So I said, I'll share with you everything I that's happened. And those are the people that you have to kind of interact with, right? I can't go change the world because some people aren't ready or they're not interested or it's not whatever. But we talked about CGMs and primary care, and he went to his doc, and his doc's like, yeah, we're not going to do that. And he's like, listen, I'm going to get a new doc. And because it's not about cost. And, the doctor understandably was nervous because like, look, if I do this, then I have to deal with the information.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm not sure. And if the doc was going to be really honest, it's like, look, I'm not sure how I'm going to deal with the information.
Well, especially in the current primary care system where docs, are encouraged to move people in and out, in and out, in and out. 15 minutes, right? That's what they say.
Yeah.
So if somebody wants to
do
continuous glucose monitoring, like how is somebody in that system going to actually deal with that, give that patient the time, information that they need to be successful? And
their algorithm is, pre-diabetic, diabetic, and then you prescribe that. That's what the decision tree goes to. And wait a minute, you're not diabetic. And I said, well, the answer, I don't want to be diabetic. But in his case, he popped it on and started eating and doing his own inventory. Because, who knows? Yeah. I mean, and you and I had some great fun talking about, different things, and how they affected us in different ways and doing these experiments to discover our own biology and how our own system was working. And as I was doing that, of course, you're starting to assimilate more information about what does blood sugar mean and why is it bad? And well, how does that mean to blood pressure? And anyway, in his case, he kind of bought onto the, get data and then make adjustments. And so he kind of, was leaning into different things. And then, I talked to him a little bit about my calcium score and kind of what that was. And after talking to him, and, I'm not a medical provider, so let's be really clear. This is not medical advice. This is Stuart's experience. But his family history, is heart disease everywhere. It's #1 killer, and we can talk about all that. But I'm like, well, I went and had a calcium score, and he went and had a calcium score. It was off the charts.
Yeah. And
his doc freaked out a little bit, like, well, we're going to put you on a statin. And that's just the algorithm for them.
Right.
And he's like, I think I can get some more information. I'd like to go do a CIMT. I'd like to do a stress test. No, we don't need it. Went to a cardiologist finally. Cardiologist said, no, we'll put you on a statin. He's like, I'm not against statins. However, I just want more data. And, and we can do that. So they started a stress test and they were 2 minutes into it. And cardiologist said, whoa. And I'm going to screw this up. But 1/4 of his heart just was dark, not pumping as he got distressed. And he'd been exercising and eating.
Right.
He'd been doing this glucose monitor, and we're talking about the different foods and what he's eating and what spikes and what comes down and how sleep affects it, all these different things that affect your biology. And the cardiologist told him to stop and said, hey, listen, as a matter of fact, I don't think I want you to exercise anymore, and we need to get you in for immediately for, is it angioplasty? Where they just go in and take a look, right? And he ended up going in the day after Christmas.
Echocardiogram?
No, where they physically go in.
Okay.
Yeah, so angiogram.
Yeah.
And they go in and take a look, and they found an 80% blockage. So while they're in, they put a stent in.
Got it.
Probably saved his life. Now, I don't know if he'd have died this year or next year.
Yeah.
But he, if you looked at him, he was fairly physically fit. The moral of the story is that I've bought onto is like, look, you want to catch stuff as early as you can.
Right.
And data is a good thing. Unfortunately, we can get overwhelmed with it. So I think it's hard and important to have somebody you can trust to talk about data, to talk about the information, right? And not like, well, I'm going to go do a genetic test and I'm MTFHR deficient, so I'm going to take a ton of vitamin B12.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, I think there's a few really interesting lessons here, right? One is the advocating for yourself, right? I mean, if he had just gone along with what his primary care doc wanted to do, he would have never found out.
He'd be on a statin and he'd still have an 83% blockage.
That's right. And who knows, right? Maybe he would live with that for 2 decades. Like, who knows? Or maybe he'd be dead next year, right? But because he advocated for himself, he was able to get it discovered and taken care of. And again, I think that's, it's important that people recognize, number one, that you can do that. You don't just have to accept what you're told, but you also have to be informed enough to know what to do, right? And in this case, because of his interactions with you, he knew what the options were for
and it wasn't,
diagnostics.
Fortunately, it wasn't just me because he was talking to others, but I think this is kind of analogous to today. ChatGPT is a great thing, but you have to know what question to ask. Like if you don't ask the right question, you don't necessarily get pointed in the right direction. But the other thing that's important, he's a beast right now. I mean, his outlook and his, up to that point, he knew something wasn't right. But now he's doing great. Mentally, physically, all that kind of stuff. And he didn't know before.
So this might be a good time to talk about this primary care question, right? So I know you just recently found a new primary care doctor, and that you actually, I think you're the first person who I ever heard say this. You interviewed them, right, to find the right primary care doc. And again, I think that's something most people. I mean, again, it's going to depend on your insurance information, your economic, status, all of that. But you do have some options. Like you don't have to just take any primary care doc. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about the process that you went through to find a primary care doc who you felt really fit your philosophy, your outlook, and what you wanted.
Yeah, and it's funny because sometimes they're full, and in full disclosure, I mean, I looked around a lot, so I tried a bunch of different things, and is it a naturopath? Is it a DO? Is it an MD? Is it concierge? Is it this? Because there's a lot of options out there, and so I was part of a concierge service for a while. I was did some naturopath stuff, and you and I actually interacted with one of the early leaders at Bastyr University in naturopath medicine, which is great. And I also prescribe to the idea of right? I think a lot of things aren't one or the other, right? So I have a Tesla, I drive an electric car, but I also have an F-350, right? So it's right? Get the right tool, as good a tool as you can. Interviewing doctors, Peter Attia made a big influence on me, kind of setting out the strategies that were important to me. Some people want access, some people want to be able to pick up the phone and call somebody 24 hours a day. So maybe that's a concierge answer. Some people may be adamant against pharmaceuticals or any drugs. And maybe a naturopath is correct. So they're in a specific category. I don't think I had any really specific bias other than the docs that I've had, my dentist, my eye doc, my primary care, they'd retired. And I realized, it's kind of a blessing. I've been around long enough to have docs, retire. I've known them for a long time, and you develop a level of trust. And, they were good. I mean, my eye doc and my dentist are still great, but my primary care, looking back, was good, but left a lot on the table for me.
Yeah.
And so I started looking around, and I've been to a couple different primary care folks. I mentioned when we were talking earlier, one guy, sat down with him and and I said, hey, how do you stay on top of things? So, I've been doing this for a long time and I kind of know what I'm doing. And, because I told him I wanted an ApoB test. He's like, what's ApoB? And I'm like, well, so we talked about it. And he's like, yeah, I've been doing this for a long time. I don't think, there's really not, basically said there's not much to learn.
Yeah.
That's not my guy.
Right.
So, the priorities I were looking for was somebody that was going to lean in, knowing that I'm going to come in with a level of enthusiasm and probably more knowledge than is good for me, and need somebody that's interested, but also willing to, interact. And it wasn't so much that I wanted 24-hour access. I didn't need to call somebody all the time, but I also want access to a good community and facility. If something does happen, if I have a broken leg, I want to know that I can go get it fixed. Or if I broke some ribs, I want to know who, that I can call somebody. And I did break some ribs, by the way. But that's how I did it. And in this particular case, I came across this doctor through some family and others and kind of interacting. He was full, so he wasn't accepting new patients. But I called and I scheduled an appointment, and he was willing to meet with me and had a conversation, and candidly just leaned in when I started talking about Optispan and, Trailblazers and,
Yeah.
How the idea and kind of the strategy here, he was incredibly interested and leaned in.
And you actually took some of the data that
Yeah.
you've collected, right?
So that was a kind of an early meeting, and he was
Yeah.
willing to take me. So then we waited a month. So then we're going to do blood work, and he goes, "Well, just tell me what you want, and we'll do that." So I gave him the whole list. The only thing, interestingly enough, they couldn't do was omega-3. So for whatever is their internal lab, omega-3 went out, which was fine, because I mean I had a long list of stuff. And I had my first official appointment with him yesterday. Another thing for me tactically, be the first one of the day, because by the end of the day, the schedule gets all kind of crazy. So I was the first one of the day, and I asked specifically what day is a light schedule.
It's just like airline flights. You want to be on the first flight of the day
First
before
flight
the
of the
schedule
day,
gets
right?
way
But
behind.
what's the schedule like? And right, so Monday morning was a good day, and we spent an hour, and I brought it was funny. I walked in, and he knew I was we talked about it before, and I had a little bunch of stuff. I was like, "Look, I can email this stuff." He's like, "Well, bring copies."
You brought your binder.
and yeah, and I had to print out a bunch of stuff and brought it in, and we kind of went through it. It was kind of fun. I kind of organized it from, talk about today to their stuff at the back of the book, like, gut biome. I'm like, "Look, I have a gut biome test. I can tell you what it was at that point, but we can't really do anything with it yet." So
I mean, honestly, as you know, we're not even quite sure how useful at this point. I mean, we know microbiome's important.
Yeah.
But it's still really early days. And how actionable is it?
Yeah.
Besides eat more fiber?
Well,
I don't know.
depending on where you get your test, it's going to be, here's your results, and by the way, here's a supplement.
Yeah.
And
well,
so
right, that's the problem.
That's what I'm skeptical of. But in the conversation with him, it was really good. When we talked through a bunch of stuff, he was, just really leaning in. And like one of the fun ones at the end, I said, "Listen, I got another test in the back of the book here, a senescent cell test. And, we'll talk about that, because I'm very optimistic. What I was looking for is a doc that, I want to be healthy and happy 5 years from now. And I want a doctor that is up to speed."
Yeah, and I think curious, right? I mean, I think that's, that at least for me, that would be one of the things that I would look for, right?
Yeah.
Is somebody who recognizes that there's more to learn out there, even if they've been doing it for 30 years, right?
Yeah.
There's still more to learn.
Well, and I think the other thing, if I was, okay, what would be better? What's more? I think some of this comes down to team as well. Like ideally, I would like, and I think that was that's part of the Optispan. I don't want to speak on behalf of Optispan, but it's about a team, right? It's not just about the doc,
Right?
It's about coaching. It's about physical movement. It's about some of these other things. So, having a doctor that's collaborative within his practice, that was kind of a question. I asked those questions kind of, in a roundabout way. How well do you get it? Because if I come in and you're not here, who would I see? And there seemed to be some, decent amount of collaborative work there.
Mm-hmm.
But I got to be honest, it's got to be rough to be a doctor, just like it is to be a teacher. Like through the pandemic, and, God bless them, because they show up every day and are doing what they're doing. And, we pick on the medical system, and, well, it's broken. And, I don't like that work. So people are working really hard. They're showing up every day trying to make it work. But, it can be better. And sometimes the inertia of the system is so much, it's just hard to move.
Yeah, I mean, I think honestly, most of the problems in the healthcare system are structural, right? And I mean, I think probably most doctors would agree that the training they get in medical school doesn't really prepare them for the real world. And certainly, they don't get sufficient training in nutrition or exercise or sleep, the things that actually can keep people healthy,
Yeah.
right? But really, I mean, I think it's a lot more of the systematic, structural things that make it really impossible for most medical providers to do preventative care. The way that the
Absolutely.
reimbursement is
Yep.
set up, the way that the administrative structures are set
Yep.
up, the incentive structures, really all revolve around um, incentivizing the lack of prevention
Yep.
and focusing on, you know, treating people after they become sick,
Yep.
right? And that's where all of the insurance really is based, right?
Yep.
And so it's very difficult to create a different system that is focused on keeping people healthy. I mean, obviously that's what we're trying to do.
Yep.
A lot of other people are trying to do that, but you kind of have to step out of the current
Yep.
structure in order to build that. And the challenges there, of course, are who pays for it, right?
Yep.
And unfortunately, at least for now, it is the individuals. Again, this goes back to this idea of your health is your greatest asset.
Yeah.
You as an individual have to make the decision that you are going to invest in your health.
Yep.
And that's not only financial, but it's going to be at least partially financial, because
Yep.
you're going to have a really hard time in the current system if you're counting on insurance and the medical care that's provided through the insurance system to keep you healthy. It's just
Yep.
not set up that way.
Yeah, I think the one thing I would say, particularly related to health or other things, there's 1,000 reasons why not. It's much easier to find a reason why not.
Yeah.
You have to find a reason why, because there's plenty of mornings I wake up and I'm like, yeah, I don't really feel like that, right? Or, and what is the reason why? And that's hard. Like that's kind of a little bit voodoo. That's a weird conversation, and you have to kind of get through. And our system isn't based on that. And I'll screw up the data, but it's $4.1 trillion we spend on healthcare, and 90% of it is on chronic disease.
Something like that.
Well, of course it is, because when somebody's sick, it's expensive. But, to your point, the system is churning in that environment. You look at how much money is spent on Alzheimer's that has had zero results.
Yeah.
Or, and your willingness to advocate, for aging as let's not use the word disease, but aging as a treatable thing that could defer some of those costs. There's an exceptional return on investment. And I think with your persistence and others in the field continuing to persist, we'll have better and better data and start influencing people more and more. And for me personally, it's like, listen, what's a better return for me than not getting sick? Because my why is pretty simple.
Yeah.
Going to ski with my grandkids. That's what I'm motivated to do.
Well,
and hopefully I'm that blessed.
Yeah, that's the other piece is, we talked before about, like what are some of the factors that can create that change within you, right?
Yeah.
And I think, one is simply recognizing that you want to change, right? You want to be healthy, right? Yeah. One is, I think you can see
you can be healthy.
Yeah, you can see it in people around you who are important to you.
Yep.
And then a why. Like what is it that your health means to you? Like, and for you, I mean, you've said it since the entire time we've known each other, right? You want to ski with your grandkids. And I'm sure it's other stuff too, but
if you unpack that, there's a lot,
yeah.
There's a lot I have to be able to do to do that.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, I think that having that sort of recognition, that vision of, what does it mean if you can get 2 decades of additional health span, right? What is that worth to you? What will you be able to do that is important?
So I think that's a big thing, frankly, that differentiates what you're doing in Optispan from the noise in the TikTok sphere. This isn't about living longer.
Yeah.
And it's not unique to Optispan either, but it's about living healthier, right? So what does an additional 10 years of good health mean?
Yeah.
Right. And so, as I started doing inventory, for example, my grandfather, amazing guy, grew up, depression, raised a family in depression. I mean, they lived in tents. I think we have it tough. We think we have it tough now, but, they lived in a tent for like a year in the middle of the depression. This is when my mom, was, little. He was a teacher. He was a coach. I should give a plug, helped start the Gonzaga basketball program. He was an athletic director. He was in the 1930s, he was the quarterback of the football team and all that stuff. But, U.S. Marshal, just this amazing, in the Navy in World War II. He retired and he sat on a chair and he was done. And I was old enough to see him retire. And then that was kind of it. And I love my grandpa for a whole bunch of reasons, but he's motivated me to I don't want to be that.
Yeah.
Right. And not that it was bad, but it could be different.
Yeah.
And I just don't think he didn't know.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean,
right. I absolutely.
Nobody said, "Hey, look, you sit down on
Have you
this chair."
ever thought about
the longer
healthspan?
the longer you sit on this chair, the less likely you are to get up.
Yeah.
And
interesting.
and I just watched him, and he ended up with Alzheimer's and dementia. I don't know if he had Alzheimer's or not because he lived a very, very long time, but it just was a long, slow. And so when I look at that, and I'm, there's so many things about my grandpa I want to be like, except that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just look at him and think, if he had had more health, the kind of things he and I might have done together.
Right.
As his grandson.
Right.
And I'm like, okay, now it's my turn.
Yep.
And so I think the other thing I would share, go back to the health and insurance stuff. I think there's 1,000 reasons why not. And one of the debates is, it's expensive. Okay, I understand that. You're just putting up barriers and saying you're rationalizing why you can't do it. But in the case of insurance, what's really interesting, most people's insurance, you have deductibles.
Right.
And you actually have responsibility to decide how you're going to spend that dough. Right. In many cases, whether I don't want to get too far into it, but health savings account, or you have to decide some of those dollars. So why not spend a little time and try and decide how you want to prioritize that spend, so to speak? Because it's not, my experience, it's not that it's been so expensive. I mean, I've done a way more blood work than most people because I'm experimenting.
Yeah.
And I'm testing, and you and I went through this. Is it Ulta Labs? Is it LabCorp? Is it where do we get? Is it Body Spec? Where do we go get DEXA scans?
Right.
But I was in the field, and I had a priority to learn to help other people discover it.
Yep.
But as I've gone through it, so I share with a bunch of people. It's like, listen, they tell me about what supplement should I take, and I'm like, I don't know. Tell me about your last blood work.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And so a couple of things to unpack there, right? One is on the insurance piece, I get it, right? And again, everybody's situation is different. You're right. Some people have HSAs, they can decide where that money goes. A lot of people
they don't have insurance at all.
Yeah, or they don't have insurance at all, for sure. But there is this mindset that I find very frustrating, which is that people are like, well, if my insurance isn't going to pay for it, I'm not going to do it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, is your health worth anything to you? Really think this through rationally. I get it. You don't want to pay for it if insurance isn't going to pay for it. I get that. But come on, this isn't about sticking it to the insurance company. This is about your health. 10 years down the road. The insurance company doesn't give a shit about your health, honestly.
Yeah, they do. They want to pay. They want to pay a little less than you're paying.
Yeah,
it's a business. It's okay. It's nothing wrong with it.
You've got to focus on your health. And so this gut reaction that if insurance isn't going to pay for it, I'm not going to do it is just dumb. I'm sorry. It is just not the thoughtful approach to your future. So
I agree.
Get over it. If that's your mindset, get over that, because it is not helping you. It might be helping the insurance company. I don't know, but it's not helping you. So that to me, I find very frustrating. I do get that these tests can be very expensive. I do get that there are wildly different economic situations. And so I think one of the things we're trying to figure out is, which of all the bevy of tests that you could do, all of the different supplements you could take, all of that stuff, like where's the biggest bang for the buck, and how do we get that information to people or offer these products to people, to as many people as possible in a way that is actually useful. We haven't figured it out yet. But I do think what you said about supplements and measuring, you can't measure everything, but the things you can measure, like it really to me doesn't make sense to take a supplement if you've got a biomarker that you can measure that can tell you whether or not you should take that supplement and or whether or not you are getting that particular biomarker into the optimal range, right? And so again, we had an episode on vitamin D. That's a really good example, right? Lots of people taking a vitamin D supplement who have never measured vitamin D. Again, I get it. That's partly because a lot of docs are just like, just take a vitamin D supplement. But, that's one where we have very good tools to measure vitamin D.
Yep.
It doesn't change rapidly, so you can get a feel for actually where your biomarker is at. It's not going to be influenced by whether you took a D pill that morning. It's going to be over the last 3 months, for example, and get yourself into the right range. Figure out how much you need to supplement to get yourself there. So I understand why people may not want to pay for the vitamin D test, but it is just a much more reasonable, responsible approach to your own health, I believe, when you can, to actually measure these things. So that was a little bit of a sermon. I didn't really mean it to be, but I do think it is important for people to appreciate that it's really on you. This goes back to taking personal responsibility. It's really on you to invest in your own health and take control and learn, become educated enough to take control of your own health.
Yeah, health for me, it can't be a once a year tune-up.
Right.
I'm going to go see a doctor for 15 minutes and do blood work and, once a year. And then, maybe blood work, maybe take my blood pressure. It needs to be a little more frequent. That you need to wash the car.
Yeah, well,
right?
some of this is just about
you need to check the tire
and,
pressure. You need to check the oil from time to time. And I think people, it's a new idea that I might be able to go get data. Because let's be honest, not that long ago, you couldn't do this. Right. But I can go get some blood work.
A lot
and
of
get
it has
some
become
data.
easier. Yeah.
I think it's a lot easier.
Although I do have to say, and again, part of my diatribe is like self-directed, because I wish that I could go back 10 years ago and tell myself what I just said and say, here's how you do it. Right. And you're right. You probably couldn't, there probably was no, Ulta Labs or equivalent where you could just go online, order the blood test yourself. Then, but there were certainly things that you could do. So some of this is my own sort of frustration that I didn't get from the reactive disease care industry what I needed, and I didn't take the self-initiative to actually educate myself and act on it 10 years ago, 20 years ago. So we talked about the weight loss. Like, what are some of the strategies that worked for you?
Well, one thing important early on, some of my early blood work, my inflammation was off the charts. Like literally my HSCRP was like the scale, it was like above 10 and there's no number over there.
Right.
It's just like red greater than 10. So it's some number over here. So we knew that was an important thing to move. And, candidly, I think, exercise and diet, I put on a CGM and I got really aggressive about looking at, my blood sugar and my glucose and my insulin levels and how I reacted to food. For me, I ate oatmeal and blueberries and honey every morning. It's good for me.
Yeah.
Right. It says it on the box.
Yeah.
It's heart healthy. And then it's like the insulin spike was phenomenal. I mean, no wonder I had some energy for a while because it was just sustained. Right. And then, by 11 o'clock, I'm starving.
Yeah.
So
I think from that perspective, CGM is really sort of amazing because you learn really quickly how much bullshit you have been sold over the years about food, right? And these things that people, even still, a lot of people will tell you are healthy meal choices are terrible for you.
Yeah, heart healthy, this, that, what, it's like, so I mean that was big for me. And then seeing like the inflammation numbers change, weight loss. And I started moving too. I'm like, I got to be honest, there was no easy bullet.
Yeah.
Right. I started exercising. I started moving. I don't have any financial interest in it, but I've got a NordicTrack FreeStrider. Right. And that machine was interesting. And then it's got a little video. It wasn't like the Peloton, which is live. So it wasn't necessarily live, but it was like these videos with an instructor kind of barking at me. And I know going through that. So I was learning about interval training and, different heart rates and what's the perceived exertion level, those different things. And it was kind of a self-awareness.
Yeah.
And
so some of this is just finding what worked for you, though, right? Because I think that's part of it, especially with exercise. I mean, nutrition as well, but exercise in particular. You've got to find.
How do you prescribe it? I mean, how do you prescribe exercise? It's really hard. What I'll tell people is like, look, what do you like? How do you like to move?
Yeah.
What movement do you like? Do you like walking? Great, walk. Right? Do you like skiing, golfing, whatever?
I agree with that.
Move.
Although I think it is important to recognize that resistance training is super important. And even if you don't like it, it's really important. So however you can build that into your exercise routine, I think.
I want to put the gauntlet down here. I'm going to do more pull-ups than you by next year.
All right.
It's not today.
You know what?
Not today.
Okay, we will come back and record that and we will see. So
I agree with you.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the point to that too also is helping people understand that's about lean tissue, right? That your muscles and your lean tissue respond to resistance training, respond to weight. But I think
and bone density.
For most people, well, we're both hard-headed. We could talk about that. That's a fun one. But for most people, just moving, right?
Yeah,
So they ask me, what should I do? I'm
you
like,
got like, where do you start? Right?
Move more, eat less. And that's how I started.
Yeah.
Move more, eat less.
So I if I remember correctly, you did find that some form of intermittent fasting seemed to work pretty well for you, at least initially, right? And again, this is something where, I've been pretty vocal that I think from a longevity perspective, the evidence that intermittent fasting or time-restricted feeding is a longevity strategy per se is pretty much non-existent, independent of the caloric restriction. But I think as a tool, especially for people who are trying to maintain a healthy body weight, those can be very powerful sort of strategies. So in your case,
I would say, this is all a weird, what is intermittent fasting? For me, caloric restriction was key, and actually fasting was really what kind of kick-started me into thinking about food differently.
Okay.
And I'll tell you what, when George first said, hey, I want you to, not eat for 24 hours twice a week. What, are you out of your mind? Like literally the reaction was, are you out of your mind? My family and people around me like, oh my God, what are you going to do? And it was kind of rough. I mean, the first couple days, but what I also did during that time is I had CGM on. I also got a Keto Mojo monitor. So I look at ketones and glucose in my blood and was able to see the different things.
Yeah, so you had some real-time feedback that this is doing something.
You bet. Yeah. And it's definitely affecting. And, what was interesting is, going back to blood work is like getting cramps, right? Okay, I'm fasting for, and I don't think I've done a fast more than 48 hours. I'm not an advocate of, 48 hour, 40 days or 7 days. I mean, I've never gone to that extreme. But after a couple, kind of cramping, it's like, well, why is that? It's like, well, how's my magnesium? How's my potassium? Well, I'm drinking lots of fluid. Well, I've just flushed all the electrolytes out of my body. But I'm fairly confident that I did shock my system a bit over time. It wasn't like, look, you're going to fast on Tuesday and on Friday you're great.
Yeah.
Like this is about, spend 30 days, take a baseline, spend 30 days, and then what happened? And so, when my inflammation numbers went literally from off the chart on the high side to off the chart on the low side, I mean, we'll share some of this data. I mean, we'll show you specifically.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's a definite, that is a definite positive mark.
Right. And I think that's part of it too. I mean, there's couple things there. One is most of this is not going to be immediate, instant gratification, but that's where these things like the continuous glucose monitor can sort of play that role. So, I mean, we've talked about it before. CGM is a very sticky tool in the sense that it is behavior modifying, right? Yeah. Not only is it behavior modifying because you get that sort of instant feedback, but also, when you see what a bagel does to your blood glucose, you can't unsee that, right?
Absolutely.
The next time, even if you're not wearing a CGM, that you think about a bagel, you might think differently about it.
Yep.
So
once you know, you can't unknow it. Yeah. Another great friend works in the fire department. He's been a diabetic, not type 1, type 2 diabetic for 15 years. Heart disease in the family, some other stuff. And we sat down, we happened to be together for a while and we're chit-chatting. I happened to have a CGM on and we talked about it. And he sent me a note a couple of weeks later, say, I got a, CGM. I was like, how could you be a diabetic for 15 years and not have been on a CGM? And, maybe they're cheaper and cheaper. And I don't have any financial interest in any of the CGM companies. There's options out there. They're not that expensive. Yeah. Like this is not about a cost. It would be nice
to have a better CGM, by the way. But,
well,
it's not hard technology.
I agree.
Somebody needs to build one.
I agree. And we can talk about technology, right? And why maybe it isn't there. And is it a medical device or not? And why is that? But in his case, he started with a CGM and I want to say over 2 months, he got his numbers so low, the docs took him all off his diabetic medication.
Yeah, I mean, that's fantastic, but it's also not surprising. Like, I think I'm certainly not going to suggest that everybody's diabetes is curable, but a lot of diabetes is curable.
Yep.
And a CGM can be a tool, but it really comes down to lifestyle, diet and exercise and sleep,
In his case, it was so motivating for me.
Yeah.
So it's selfish to me because when he was sending me information and sending his enthusiasm and sending me screenshots of his, like, here's what I looked like. I'd go up above 300 and I'd stay there all day long. And now I barely go above 100.
Yeah. So here's the thing that, again, this is one of these frustrating things, right? Where, as you know, as part of the corporate wellness program, we see a lot of pre-diabetes. People don't realize they've got, some people have diabetes and don't realize it, but certainly a lot of undiagnosed pre-diabetes. That is almost completely fixable. And that's
the trajectory I was on.
There was
no way I could argue
right?
that was me.
But it is fixable, and our current reactive disease care system does nothing. Essentially nothing. We are, condemning millions of people to diabetes by inaction. And it's just extremely frustrating because it's not that hard to inform people to use these tools to inform people. Now, of course, not everybody is going to modify their lifestyle, but a lot of people will if presented with the information. And so this is, it's frustrating, but it's also, I think, inspiring because there are opportunities there. And so we want to be able to help people take advantage of those opportunities.
Well, I think
to get them on a better trajectory.
You would agree that, metabolic syndrome is an underlying cause for all of this other stuff, and it's compounding interest. And that's the other hard part, is like, I want to live in the day, I want to live in the moment, and I want to be here now. But the decisions and things I'm doing today, it's compounding interest. And so, maintaining high blood sugar for a long period of time is going to do some damage. And, can I play a mental game with myself. Well, one of the inventory things I do is I like to have a conversation with 5-year-old Stuart and 80-year-old Stuart in the room at the same time. And so sometimes I'll ask myself, what would 5-year-old Stuart say? What would you say to 5-year-old Stuart? What would 80-year-old Stuart say? What would you say to him? Right? And most of the time I want 80-year-old Stuart to say thank you. Right? Like, would he say thank you? And then I'm like, okay, that kind of helps me sometimes get out of the space. Now, don't get me wrong. I have no control when it comes to M&Ms. This isn't about control. This isn't about I've somehow created a military lifestyle. Fasting is 100% a caloric restriction thing for me, and I'm less motivated to, it changed my life. And ketones and talking about, I experimented with how my body would react. And I know my body's going to react differently over time. So it has to be a morphing strategy. But, at the end of the day, I want 80-year-old Stuart and the people around me to say, thank you. Did I do the right thing? But anyway, it's not military. You put a bowl of M&Ms in front of me, well, they're gone.
Again,
I think M&Ms are, sorry.
You have to recognize, I know you recognize this, but we all have to recognize there's not
peanut M&Ms specifically
a one-size-fits-all solution, right? Or that, the idea that you have to be perfect is just self-defeating, right? So you shouldn't even go
compounding,
there.
But
I think
self-talk is a compounding interest as well.
Creating a strategy that is sustainable and finding a strategy that is sustainable in terms of lifestyle modification is the key. And like for you, like for me, I would much rather, and it's easier for me to maintain a pretty clean diet most of the time. If I go off of that, I don't worry about it. But most of the time I maintain a pretty clean diet. And I don't like to fast. Like I don't think I've ever, I might have gone 24 hours without eating, once in my life, but I don't like it.
It's gnarly.
So
it can get gnarly.
But for me, I have found that I'm able to maintain what I believe is a healthy body weight through just most of the time eating a pretty clean diet. And I like it, and it works for me.
Well, you have data to prove it. We can talk about DEXA scans and how your body weight and you have data to prove it, which is right. But when you say eating clean, like people say, well, what does that mean? It's like, well, you got to talk about processed foods and hyper processed foods. I mean, I think there's no argument.
Yeah, I'll go into detail at some point on a podcast episode about what I've done, but not because that is the right way, but because that's one strategy that worked. But I mean, from a simple person, and it's still improving, right? I think even if you had asked me, 8 months ago, from 8 months to now, my diet has improved. Mostly because I was relying on things like protein bars, and I've took them out of my diet.
Yeah.
And I've found different ways to fill what those were filling, right, with better food choices.
Yep. Yep. Well, the other thing I would say I think is interesting is, the guilt people feel about how they are, that kind of, oh, well, I can't do anything about it. There's no better time to get started than now.
That's right.
And you got to ask yourself, a year from now, what would you start today that a year from now you would say, boy, I'm glad I started.
Yeah.
Because that's kind of the horizon you have to have. But I also prescribe to the idea that, you and I are here because our ancestors did some stuff. And when I say did some stuff, they survived. It wasn't that long ago that, it was how many calories can I get in my belly today?
Sure.
Or I don't survive. If I twist my ankle, I'm dead. If I get an infection, I'm dead. And, so this is not new news, but, over the last couple hundred years is when we've got, comfortable.
Yeah.
The Comfort Crisis is a kind of a great book, a little on the bro side, but some of the stories that I've prescribed to there is that if I go back, and hundreds of thousands of years of human history, they were surviving. And all of that DNA, all that programming, all those survival skills, if you will, in the biology is still in us. And yet I live in a world where I literally have access to unlimited calories.
Right.
And it's not because I'm wealthy. It's not because I have a lot of money. Most people.
No, if anything,
place,
it's the lower socioeconomic status individuals that are even more susceptible because the really, really high calorie, really, really crappy food is cheaper.
It's cheap,
right?
It's
Which
cheap.
is,
and it's not a conspiracy, right? I don't believe the food industry is just creating products.
It's no more conspiracy than anything else that is about making money, right?
They're earning a living. Unfortunately, the priority hasn't been. It's been about the bliss factor and how well it good it tastes and how cheap can you make it, as opposed to what is the long-term effect on the human beings that are consuming this. And and I think I'm not a scientist, but I play one on TV when I'm hanging out with you. Our biology hasn't changed enough to adapt to what I have. So I have to discover how is my body reacting to the world around me and the things that I put in. And I have to go back to where we started, have to have some accountability for doing that.
Yeah. And I mean, for people who don't really believe that that what we just said is the case, all you have to do is look at pictures from people 50 years ago, right?
Yeah.
If you look at people in the 1970s, you don't see obese people walking around.
Yeah.
I mean, our environment has changed. A lot less.
Yeah.
Like if you see a picture of 20 people, you're very unlikely to see an obese person, at least not morbidly obese in the 1970s. And it's not because genetics have changed. They haven't in 50 years. Because the environment has changed and has changed quite dramatically. And so this is both, I think it should be somewhat reassuring to people that it's not because you're weak or you're a bad person or anything else. It's because our environment has changed in a way, and there are certain people who are even more susceptible to this obesogenic environment.
Yep.
But having said that, you still have to take personal responsibility for your own health, or you make the decision that you're just going to experience the negative consequences of that environment, right? I mean, that's the decision point that we're at. It's not about what is fair or what is right or wrong. It's about recognizing the situation and taking the personal responsibility.
I think that's a huge part of this, the guilt and shame and like, should I get started? And because I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of people at different places and different times, and and the guilt and shame. It's like, this isn't about guilt and shame. Like, your DNA is programmed to, because I believe, my body thinks it might starve tomorrow.
Yeah.
Right. It doesn't know, because for hundreds of thousands of years, the ancestors who survived were the ones who survived and why we're here.
Yeah. I think also the other piece that's really hard for a lot of people is, especially if you have let yourself go for 20 years, right? You get to a point where, it's very, very difficult. And I get it. I actually, despite the fact that I didn't live a particularly healthy lifestyle, I feel very fortunate that I never got to the point where I was very overweight, very out of shape. Like, I always had been active and never became, at least clinically obese. I was certainly overweight, but I was never clinically obese. I can appreciate that it probably is much harder if you need to lose 60 pounds as opposed to feeling like you need to lose 20 pounds psychologically, if not physically, right?
Yeah.
And
you know,
so
even that conversation is like, look, you don't need to lose 60.
That's right.
You need to lose 5.
You need to start.
You got to start.
And,
you got to
and
start.
I think stories like yours, success stories, right, are
Well,
powerful.
thank you for saying success, because I still got a lot of work to do. I feel like
we all do.
The story is yet to be told.
Yeah. No, trust me, I get it, and I feel the same way. But I think the fact that it doesn't have psychologically, it is very important to recognize that this is a journey, and it is a journey for the rest of your life, and it is the journey itself that is the reward, right? And starting is the most important part.
Well, you and I both grew up in an environment where, I mean, I grew up at least in an environment where, soda was everywhere.
Yeah.
I mean,
I remember the super big gulps, right? Every day. Yeah.
I mean, absolutely.
44 ounces or whatever.
It's amazing. I mean,
ounces.
bliss factor over the top.
Crazy.
Remember when Pringles came? I mean, Pringles, like, you pop this can open and like talk about ultra processed, and and it was salty and it was amazing, and it was available, and you just you consumed like so candidly, I shouldn't pick on Pringles or be specific, but I don't drink soda, like sugary. And what I discovered, this is also random, orange juice is supposed to be good for you, right? It's orange juice.
There you go.
Like, 'cause that's what I thought. And I had CGM on, and I slugged down a glass of orange juice, and it's like, oh my gosh, what just happened?
And I think there's so many of
these. I just ate 50 oranges in about 10 seconds.
I mean, we talked about what people think is healthy and what's actually healthy, and that's another good example. But also there are so many like easy tips that if you implement them as habits, right, can have a huge impact. Like, don't drink your calories.
Yeah.
Like you just said, cut out the sugary sodas, cut out the sugary juices, right? If you drink coffee, get used to drinking black coffee. Like, or again, people have different feelings about artificial sweeteners. I'm fortunate, again, I grew up on vending machine coffee, so you can get, I love black coffee. Like, I can drink any coffee, but,
your little Keurig pod is like a home run.
Yeah. But I mean, this idea that, just cutting out calories from liquids is a great way if you're trying to lose weight to, for many people, reduce your total caloric consumption. And ultimately, it comes down to calories in and calories out.
Well, I know for me as well, looking at a scale, that's terrifying. What does that mean? The DEXA scan was interesting because I kind of said, listen, I don't care about losing weight. I want to lose fat, and I want to lose fat around my organs.
Right, visceral fat.
And am I doing the right thing to do that? And watching those numbers move was very positive. Watching the biomarkers, watching cholesterol. I've always been kind of high cholesterol. Yeah. And it's just kind of okay, and it was coming down slow. Watching my inflammation markers go boop. Yeah. Right? Feeling better, feeling more motivated, and all of those things just reinforces it. So one of the other things, success begets success. And it's once you can't unknow it. Yeah.
So if you're comfortable with it, let's talk about testosterone. Yeah. I know you've had a super interesting story there, and this is another area where I think it's very timely, right? Because first of all, testosterone is super big. Like, there are all these telehealth companies. You can go online and just say, I feel like I have low T, and they'll prescribe you testosterone.
I mean, there's a commercial with 2 amazing football players I idealize, and they look great. Yeah.
So there's that side of it where it's suddenly become much more in your face, go get T prescribed. But then there's the other side where there's this whole, huge community of men in their 40s, 50s, 60s who have never had their hormones tested, are suffering from hormone deficiency or dysregulation, all sorts of negative consequences associated with that, including bone density problems. I mean, it's true in women as well. I think in women, it is more recognized because of the menopause transition, right? Everybody knows that all women are going to experience menopause. Now,
are we going to be careful here? Because our wives are going to come into this. Well, and I was just going to say women's hormones are weird.
I was going to say
their whole life is different. Their whole lives hormones are going like this.
Of course. Yeah. But I think the midlife hormone changes, I think in women, it's recognized. I'm not saying that it has been handled any better. I think there are all sorts of complications with, and, many, many problems with the way the women's health study had an impact on hormone replacement therapy in women. But I think in men, it hasn't been as appreciated, I believe, how common hormone dysregulation in that 40 to 60 year period is. It's very much undiagnosed. And again, this goes back to what we were talking about before about if you can measure it, you really should.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times now, men are getting prescribed testosterone. And in theory, they're supposed to measure it, but really oftentimes they might measure total testosterone, which is pretty much meaningless in the absence of other data. And really they're prescribing testosterone a lot of times based on symptoms, which is important, but there's really no quality control to that. So I think it's an interesting time. And I think this would be, your case example might be a good one of both finding out that there was something going on that you wanted to be aware of and do something about, and then the specific strategy of what you did and kind of where you're at. And I don't want to suggest the story's told, but there's been some interesting progress.
So there's a couple of things I want to say real quick. First of all, the women's side of it, and this is a shout out to my wife. Women's hormones are, thank goodness, they do what they do, but just literally the physical biological cycle is radical. If you look at measuring, and I'm not a scientist, but I can look at data, and I've done a lot of it's insane the shifts that they do. If a typical male had to deal with the hormonal shifts that a woman does, we'd lose our mind. We literally would. So the fact is, what women have dealt with is much probably more challenging from a hormone. And unfortunately, because young men, and it's not a conspiracy, maybe it is, have done most of the science for so long, we've left that on the table. So I want to give a shout out to women that I understand a little bit.
Well, and I will say one of the things that has been, I think, very exciting in the field of aging biology is the growing attention that female reproductive aging is now getting. So like you just said, for a long time, most of the studies, if there were studies of reproductive aging at all, they were using either male mice or human men. Now we're actually starting to see a lot of attention being paid to this area. And I think with opportunities for, some really big impacts for female reproductive health by understanding the biological aging process and how that impacts ovarian senescence and things like that. So it isn't an area of the field where there has been pretty dramatic growth in attention and research and funding over just the last five or 6 years.
Yeah. Well, and over time we get more information, so that's good. So I'm really optimistic. But I want to make sure I give a shout out to my wife and your wife. Like, look, I think I have much better understanding today than I did in the past. The second thing I would say is, for those that are out there like rushing to do a TRT supplement or ashwagandha, whatever random podcast they heard, and you haven't measured before you do it, really?
So what should we measure? What have you learned? I mean,
okay, so let's talk about that. So, my testosterone level has been fairly low for quite a while. I don't have a lot of history of it.
This goes back to what we were talking about before. Do you remember when your first testosterone
I think
test
my first one, in fact, we'll share this data. We'll put it up as a chart. Testosterone, maybe 5 years ago.
Okay.
Was like the first time we
And you
measured.
were how old then?
54, 53.
Yeah. I think my first testosterone test, I was probably 51. And it was only because I really pushed my primary care doc to measure it. And he only measured free testosterone.
Well, see that. So that's the other. So to talk about specifically, he
only measured total testosterone.
Yeah, it's like, okay, here's the number, right? And I think docs probably are challenged now because of all of the ads. So people are coming in and say, I want this. So I'm going to goof up the words. I love how you always help me when I goof them up. The endocrine system. So the hormones.
Endocrine system.
So it's a system, right? So spend a little time, understand the system. Where does testosterone come from? How is it made? So in my particular case, I had some understanding. You have a pituitary gland, produces FSH and LH that stimulate the testes to produce testosterone, and then it's a cycle. And sperm. And then you have estrogen and other, repeat cycles that kind of, it's a cycle. Well, also on my numbers, my FSH and LH were pretty low. And so what we decided, kind of in the conversation, it's like, look, let's diagnose whether I can produce testosterone naturally or not. That would be a first step.
Right.
I'm not against TRT at all, right? So I'm also past the age of reproductive. I have 4 kids, and I love my kids, but that's enough.
So a couple things that are maybe worth expanding on a little bit, right? As you said, I'm past the age of having kids. So why is that relevant? Because many times when you go on testosterone therapy as a man, once once you start taking testosterone, that will cause exogenous testosterone.
Yes.
That will cause your endogenous, your production of testosterone by the testes to go down.
Yep.
In many cases, it's unclear whether that is something that can be reversed. It can be in some cases
Yeah.
if you start young, but it can also be irreversible. So that's where this question of, if you know you're done having children, that is less of a concern if
Correct.
you are going to permanently shut off your own ability to produce testosterone. What it does mean, though, is you should be at least aware that you might need to be on testosterone therapy for the rest of your life if you want to maintain a normal level of testosterone.
My mom had a hysterectomy for a whole bunch of reasons, long time ago. And it's a very similar kind of scenario from a male standpoint. So there's similar implications for females, right?
Right.
And I agree. So my understanding is, if you take it externally, you reduce your ability to produce it. Thank goodness, what I said earlier, the bodybuilders and stuff have done all this hacking for so many years, and now we've learned a ton of lessons from them. And is it reversible or not? So anyway, the strategy that...
So the other thing that might be worth mentioning is you mentioned FSH and LH, so follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone. And what you said is that you had low total testosterone?
Yes.
Low free testosterone?
Yep.
Was that because you had high SHBG, serum hormone binding globulin?
Nope. So not to get too far into it, but free T is roughly 2 to 5% of your total testosterone if you're SHGB. So in my particular case, at 300 total testosterone, I couldn't send my SHGB low enough to get my free testosterone high enough.
Got it. So you had low SHBG, lowish, or normal.
Relatively.
But low LH and FSH. The reason why I think that's relevant is because, there are at least a couple of big buckets. There's all sorts of different, like everybody's different, but there are a couple of big buckets, especially in men our age when you have low testosterone, right? There's low testosterone, high SHBG, low free testosterone. Oftentimes then you will have high LH and FSH. That's primary hypogonadism, I believe. And then, but your case is different. You had low FSH and LH, which would suggest potentially not. So the high FSH and LH may suggest a problem with the testes in producing testosterone. The low FSH and LH may suggest a problem with the pituitary.
A lollygag and pituitary.
Right, but potentially, if you can fix that, the ability to still produce testosterone in the testes, because it is the FSH and LH that signal to the testes to produce testosterone in sperm. See, we both learned a lot, because that I did not learn in my research on the biology of aging, but I have learned since then.
Well, and early on, as we talked, it's like, okay, well, can I reduce SHGB? Well, how do you do that? And
I remember you tried boron, right?
A couple of studies on boron. I'm like, okay, what's the risk? And this is about risk and reward. I'm not just jumping off the deep end on this stuff. I want to have a level of confidence and validate. And a lot of times I'll ask somebody who knows nothing about it. And, if they say, what? Then I'm like, well, maybe I've reinforced my own bias. But in the case of boron, in fact, my SHGB did go down. I did find with a boron supplementation that, I was able to move it down. But
there's a couple papers suggesting that could be the case for some people.
It was true in my case. Is it sustainable over time? I don't know. If I keep taking boron for a long time, it worked for me for, I think it was like a 4-week experiment.
But you didn't really have super high SHBG to begin with.
Correct. And I can look at the statistics. I don't have the exact number, what percentage, but it was significant.
Okay.
Right, that it dropped. So to your point, it's like, okay, like what I decided the experiment is to test, can I produce it? Is it my pituitary? So I chose a clomid cycle. And I don't want people out there rushing out to go ask your doctors for clomid. And this is just my experience. So this is not medical advice.
And you also did it with a physician.
100%. 100%. Well, you need a prescription to get the clomid, but with all due respect, getting prescriptions probably isn't that hard.
Right.
And with all due respect, testosterone, you can go down to your local gym and get stuff they made in their bathtub.
Let's not do that.
And I know some people doing that. And I'm like, are you out of your mind? Like, what are you doing? But neither here nor there. That's, more power to people. There's room for everybody.
And so take me through the clomid. What is the
So the
thought
idea of
process
clomid,
there?
in my understanding, was it's an estrogen blocker. So the pituitary does not receive the signal that testosterone is being produced, and the hope is that will increase FSH and LH production, and that also will increase the testosterone production.
Got it.
We were trying to 300 was my baseline, is kind of the low end of acceptable.
Yeah, that's total testosterone.
Total
which again,
testosterone.
it doesn't. I mean, it can be an indicator, but unless you know what your free testosterone is,
free T should be, at least for me, what I was hoping for, between 2 and 5% of that, which it was. So my free T was, and I was measuring that as well.
Got it.
And so the idea was to maybe see, let's get my testosterone up around 500. And my free T 2% to 5% of that, and what does that mean? How does that work? So the clomid cycle for me actually was, and we can share the protocol if people are interested. Actually, if somebody wants a comment and wants to know, have them send you an email, and we'll give them the exact protocol. But it made almost an immediate effect on my FSH and LH went up, probably because I was so, I don't know, I joke about this, but my misspent youth, probably hurt my pituitary. I mean, I don't know.
It's hard to know, right? Again, this is where if you had the historical data, you might know, but
so
you are where you are.
Pituitary is a lollygagger. It did increase FSH and LH and an immediate increase in my testosterone. And I did get it up into the 500 range.
And what do you mean by immediate? Like how
I think within a week.
Wow.
Yeah, within a week. I think I did my first blood work. So I did a baseline, let's be clear. Did a baseline, a full blood workup, a full blood panel. And then I tested every 2 weeks, and it was an 8-week cycle. I was going to make people send an email to find the protocol. So I'm not going to give it.
You just did.
Well, I didn't tell you how much I took and how often I took it. But then I did a small blood work every 2 weeks. So I measured FSH, LH, SHGB, total testosterone, and free testosterone.
Every 2 weeks.
Every 2 weeks.
Wow.
And I think that test, by the way, to give you a sense of scale, was $50.
Wow.
$50. Okay. And, doc, I was like, yeah, don't worry about it. We'll test it at the end. I'm like, nope, I want to measure and see how I'm doing during the time. Yeah. So it went up fairly quickly. So the first blood test, the FSH and LH production was up and testosterone production was up.
And have you noticed a difference in the way you feel?
Yeah. So to give you, this is all subjective now, right? But, I've been exercising. I love to ski, as you know. And I had some trips up to Whistler planned. And I literally, my subjective, I had a couple of buddies of mine were up there with me that, one of them still at Microsoft working in the stress bucket. I mean, he's got a great job, very senior guy, doing great work. And I just was watching him and I'm like, oh my God, you're killing yourself. And then another guy that had just retired, very successful career at Microsoft. And I skied for 9 days straight. I went helicopter skiing 9 days straight. And these guys were looking at me like, at day 2, they're tapping out like, hey, we're going to take a day off. I'm like, great, I'll see you later today. And I was just not, I'm not sending it off cliffs, and the helicopter skiing isn't jumping off on cliffs. But, I was paired up with some young folks out there. And one of the guys said to me, he said, how old are you? And I said, 57. He's like, oh my God, we're having a hard time keeping up with you. And I think that was a direct result. So the impact that I saw, I think not so much fatigue, but my, what's the word I'm looking for? I just had more,
like resilience, your ability
more
to
resilience,
come back the next day, keep doing it.
And if I'm super motivated to grow, and I don't want to be a bodybuilder, but if I want to maintain lean body mass, and I want to do resistance training, and I want to beat Matt Kaeberlein on pull-ups,
there you go.
I'm going to have to do some stuff. I'm going to have to do some stuff. And that's not going to just be thinking about it. So anyway, so that was my experience. So now I've been off. That clomid cycle was over 8 weeks ago.
So you intended to do an 8-week cycle? Is that what you said?
It was a very specific protocol.
And why stop at 8 weeks?
Just to stop and now see, will it sustain?
And why? And so is the idea that maybe reboot the entire system and see if it's persistent.
Kickstart the pituitary and see what happens. And for me, I don't think clomid is a long-term. I don't want to supplement clomid. There's
why
this.
Not? What are the side effects?
I understand that the science isn't really great about long-term use of clomid. It's very, very safe. We know a lot about it for women's health and short-term cycles of it. We don't know a lot about taking clomid over a long period of time.
Okay.
And there's some other alternatives. So synthetic LH and FSH, testosterone. I'm not against external testosterone, but so now I went off for 8 weeks, and unfortunately, my most recent my LH is coming down, and FSH is coming down. I don't have the testosterone and free T number, which if I check my phone, maybe it's in today because I did a test 2 weeks ago.
And how long have you been off the clomid?
About 8 weeks.
Okay.
Yeah. About
okay. So
8
it's been a
weeks.
while. Yeah.
Yeah. So, so we'll see.
All right.
So I talked with my primary guy yesterday, and what was great is he just leaned in. He's like, most people are in here asking me for, some magic bullet, and, I have a pretty specific kind of target that I think is correct, and I'm going to be willing to do some of these other things. Now, ancillary to this, which I shared with you, which is a shocker and a head scratcher for everybody, my cholesterol numbers went amazing. So I've historically had borderline high cholesterol, say 200, right? And, we're starting to talk with my docs about statins. Okay, we should.
And this was even after all the weight loss, intermittent fasting.
Yeah, coming down a little bit, ApoB, going the right direction, which is fine. Like, okay, look, if you keep doing that trajectory
it's better than going the other direction.
Over the next 10 years, but it was kind of the borderline. Can we do something, and I believe in Peter, and, let's get ApoB as low as possible. And, I don't have a huge risk for heart disease, and, not a lot of family history, a 0 calcium score. I've had, my primary care guy's like, look, if you got a 0 calcium score, I'm not putting you on a statin. But regardless, during this time, as I did a baseline, a full, panel at the beginning and a full panel at the end, the one thing that jumped off the page was my cholesterol number. So not only has my cholesterol gone from 200 down to like 130, my ApoB went from, borderline high to, I don't know if I have it in front of me, from 128 down to 72.
Wow.
And even equally interesting, my LP(a), which is, people maybe should do some show notes so people can track what we're talking about. But the LP(a), which shouldn't change, is pretty hard to change. It went, I think, pretty significantly from almost 95 down to 66.
And this is all after starting the clomid. It's like, it's obviously causation, correlation, but it is
head scratcher. Now, I also broke my ribs at the end of the trip up at Whistler. So maybe it was a broken ribs. I don't know. But the one thing in my numbers that have stayed, now it was such a shock that I'm like, look, I got to do another test. And you recall with George, and I went and did an outside test from Ulta to compare to LabCorp. Did somebody screw something up? And it validated. And I just did another full panel, and those numbers are still really low.
Okay,
so
interesting. Yeah.
I'm not giving advice to people, but for me, it's so motivating. Like, whatever I'm doing, I'm going to keep doing it.
Right.
I'm going to kind of keep shoveling. The tide is coming in. This is not about magic bullets, but the tide's coming in, and I have to keep shoveling, and it's going to keep coming in. Eventually, I'll put the shovel down, but for now. So
that's a pretty cool story, though. And I think, again, it's just useful for people maybe to appreciate who may not appreciate yet the complexity around the hormone story. And first of all, again, I don't know what the percentages are, but I'm guessing it's a pretty decent percentage of men, certainly in their 50s and 60s, who have low free testosterone or other hormone abnormalities and could benefit from knowing that. But you're probably not going to know. You're certainly not going to know it. You might feel it, but you're not going to know it if you don't measure it. And measuring these other things like FSH and LH and SHBG and free testosterone is really the only way to get a picture of how the entire system is working, and then potentially give you ideas for alternative ways if you find that it probably makes sense to try to raise your free testosterone, alternative ways to approach that.
Here's the thing I would say too is, people looking for magic bullets, I also did some of the low-hanging fruit before I did this.
Yeah, that's right.
So how are you sleeping?
Right.
Okay. I was born. What does that mean? We need to talk about sleep. What are you eating? How's your nutrition? How much are you moving? So I have done a lot of the low-hanging fruit, improved a lot of other numbers and other things leading up to this.
Right.
And the idea of testosterone may help my muscle protein synthesis and other things to maintain lean tissue, but also my, duration and ability to exercise.
Right. That's right.
So when people's like, oh, I'm going to go raise my free tree, you know what? Do some of the other stuff first. Not that I'm against supplements or taking, but if you think like, oh, I'll fix tea and that'll fix everything, kind of in my case, I think it will help me with some motivation and mentally, and maybe I can work out, but I can work out longer. That's where the benefit's going to come from, in my opinion. It's not just that my T is higher. It's because I'm going to be able to exercise and have more motivation and more duration in my ability to I don't know if that makes sense, right?
Yeah. Well, and again, I think, it's going to be very individual for each person as well. If you start taking testosterone therapy and you don't feel any different, maybe you weren't actually limited in testosterone signaling, right? Again, I think everybody's different, but I would agree, and this is sort of what I was alluding to before. There's these extremes, and one extreme is just prescribe tea to everyone, right? And I think that clearly is a mistake. But the other is that a lot of people don't know where they're at, and they've got their health is suboptimal because they are dysregulated with these sex hormones as part of the normal aging process. And we've specifically talked about male hormones because we're both males, and it's we both experience different aspects of this, but this is true in women as well. It's just super important, and it is still, I think, a somewhat neglected area, or the approach because it's been recognized as a neglected area, at least in men's health, is just the opposite extreme, which is just throw testosterone at everything, which is not a good solution either.
Yeah, I agree. So it's funny, depending on what we put on the headline here is testosterone experiment. This podcast would get a bajillion views probably immediately, and unfortunately, but hopefully people will have listened to it, and I've been honest and fair that's been my experience. And I got to tell you that I want to tell you another fun one. Other number is over time, or early on, my iron and ferritin numbers were really high.
Yeah.
And the prescription for that was go donate blood.
Bloodletting,
and it's really funny, and humor is important to me, right? You want to laugh about some of this stuff, but it was like, oh, come on, like bloodletting is like this medieval science, but I didn't know anything about that. Now, what's interesting, then I started donating blood, and I've been very consistent donating blood because I understand a little bit about science and research and how important it is. Not only are you saving potentially your friend's life who needs a pint of blood, but other blood is going to research. And I'm like, I'm good with that. So I've been very consistent. And I just got a donation ago. I got they gave me a gallon. I made it to a gallon. But my iron numbers were like, are really low. And I'm like, oh, okay, wait a minute. Maybe I need to ease up on that. But see, I wouldn't know.
And again, I think iron's a really interesting one. And, there's certainly some thought that iron deficiency is an underappreciated problem in some people. There's another school of thought that iron drives a lot of different age-associated damage and reactive
if you have
oxygen
too much
species.
Of it.
Too much iron. I mean, I honestly don't know. Like, it's complicated. The biology of iron is immensely complicated, and so I don't know where I kind of land there. But
I know for me, looking at the ranges, that I was way high.
I mean, if you're way out the range either way.
And it's like, look, you need to bring that. I'm like, okay.
I think high iron in particular is much more common in men than in at least premenopausal women. Because as part of the cycling process, right? In women, they shed off some of that excess iron. But in men, it is true. Donating blood is a really good way to reduce your iron overload.
Well, what I love about this, what I've learned, to be honest, and interacting with you and the culture of maybe, right? I'm open-minded, maybe I'm curious, but risk and reward it's a complex system. Right. So this isn't just about single point solutions necessarily. You pull the string here, it's going to affect over here. And so trying to and you can't control it all and have a handle over all of it. But how do I kind of keep, some idea and try and keep myself in some homeostasis that's healthy?
And I think
because my historical baseline was not good.
Right. I think also recognizing where your areas of emphasis need to be, and they can change over time, right? But some people, it's going to be very clearly the metabolic piece that really you need to focus on first.
It's probably a first priority for
a lot of people.
We could guess most of the people out there.
Heart disease,
I'm
Another
working
big
in high
one.
schools. I hate to
Yeah.
say this out loud, but in the not so much the grade school, the kindergartners, they're all just busy and moving. But at high school, I'm walking around going, "Oh my gosh, is this worse than when I was here?" I mean, I don't know, but I'm looking around now and knowing what I know now, there's a lot of people here that are on a bad trajectory,
Yeah.
terrible trajectory, no doubt about it. And that's a big passion of Dave's, frankly, is like,
Right.
how do you get education into a place where people can, make a difference, early in their trajectory.
How do we make healthspan optimization viral? How do we gamify it, right? I think those are important ideas. And are there ways that, I mean, I think, look, let's start with the people in their 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s. They're going to be a receptive audience, I think, because it is personal. Aging, I mean, I don't know for you, but for me, aging didn't really become personal until I was certainly in my 40s, maybe by early 50s, right?
When you become a parent, that's an interesting.
Yeah, that's true. But I think, are there strategies where health optimization can be made appealing to younger people? Certainly, I think, we talked about how the environment has changed, the societal forces that push people towards poor health are even more pronounced than they were when we were kids. But look, when we were kids, it was pretty bad. Like I said, I started smoking in 7th grade. I started drinking alcohol in 7th grade. I was downing, at least a couple of super big gulps of Coke every day, eating crap. I don't know if it's worse. It's different. It's certainly a different environment. Fortunately, young humans are resilient and able to overcome a lot of that. But getting on to better health span trajectory before you develop a chronic age-related disease is certainly a better path than after you develop a chronic age-related disease. But fortunately for some of these things, they're not irreversible, right? And I think that's the other lesson is for most people, it's never too late as long as you're still alive.
Well, what's the number one rule? The first rule?
Don't die.
Don't die. Matt's first rule. Don't die.
Necessary, but not sufficient for optimal health span.
I don't know if it's worse. And our childhood and our growing up, I'm lucky to be alive.
I feel that way too.
And we definitely
in
are,
more than one sense of that phrase.
We are resilient, and I'm an optimist. I mean, Optispan, I was gravitated. I mean, I'm an optimist, and so things are going to be hard, and that's okay, and things are going to be good, and that's okay. And
I agree. Although I want to come back to this idea because one of the things that has been very powerful for me is, again, recognizing that the journey itself is really the reward. And sometimes it's hard, but you know what? It also should be fun and it should be inspiring and energizing. And I think for me, it is, and that's great. And I think trying to keep that mindset that, this is a lifelong rest of my life, however long that is, it's a lifelong journey. And, there will always be new things to learn, new ways to improve, but being on the journey itself is very inspiring.
Yeah, I agree. I've been fortunate to be curious, right? It's like I want to know how this story unfolds, but it's not that way every day. I mean, I don't wake up every morning inspired by any means. Let's be clear. I'm not like, woo, let's go get on.
There are days where you got to power through and just say, I'm going to do it.
Yeah, there's some days, but without the valleys, this is all not new, right? The philosophers for thousands of years have talked this way, but the valleys and the peaks is what makes it worthwhile. And some expectation that it's supposed to be easy, I think that's terrifying to me. Interacting with people and, like, oh, I'm just going to take a pill and I'm going to feel better. Like, yeah, you probably will. And, when I was young, I was freaked out about the world. And so I got loaded. And that was part of it. You look around, it's hard to have some self responsibility and say, like, look, I got to be responsible for making some of these changes. And if I'm going to leave people with one thing, it's like, look, you it's not that you have to be in control. It's not so much a control thing, but you have some responsibility.
Yeah. You got to make the decision.
And the decisions that you're going to make today, it's compounding interest, right? And, we think about finances and all that other stuff and why you put money in a 401k if you can and whatever. But your health's the same thing. It's compounding interest. And I agree with you that I would have loved to have made some investments earlier because it might have affected me in a better place. But I also feel incredibly blessed that I'm a statistical anomaly. And, I know I am at this point to be, my age and not
Yeah.
have, what is a typical or average American, situation. I love talking to George, the Optispan doc. I'm like, look, George, I want to put you out of a job. And his eyes get big. And I'm like, listen, I'd love to be here and have a short conversation and not have you have any work. Well, that's interesting. That's a different level of like, I'm going to go to the doc who's going to fix me.
Yeah.
Like, I'm going to go to a doc and put you out of a job, Anyway.
Yeah, you want a doc that has the preventative maintenance mentality, not the repair shop mentality, for sure.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. So I think you need to go do some pull-ups.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm probably going to start with, we won't get into that, but I'm going to start. There won't be pull-ups to start.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, next time we will do a deep dive into the data. And at some point, I've got to talk about my hormone story too. So that might be a good
I'm
good
happy to
time
come
do
back
that.
and ask you pithy
Yeah,
questions.
there you go. Awesome. All right. Well, thanks, Stuart. And thank you all for watching this episode of the Optispan podcast. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. If you're not a subscriber yet, please subscribe. And we'll see you next time on the podcast.